You don't meet them as villains. That's the first illusion. They don't arrive wearing warning signs or announcing intent. They arrive as charm, confidence, intensity, intelligence, sometimes as wounded souls, sometimes as leaders, sometimes as lovers, sometimes as saviors. And that is why they get access. To understand toxic people, you must first understand this. They are not driven by chaos, they are driven by control. Not always conscious, not always strategic, but relentless. What we call toxic is not random cruelty. It is a psychological structure built around four converging traits, the dark tetrad, each compensating for a profound inner emptiness that cannot tolerate vulnerability. At the center of this structure is a core truth most people never see. Toxic people are terrified of being exposed as ordinary, powerless, or unseen. So they construct a personality designed to dominate perception, not reality perception, because perception is easier to control than truth. The first layer is narcissism, not self-love. Self-fragility disguised as superiority. Inside the narcissistic mind, the self is not stable, it is inflated to avoid collapse. Identity is built externally, fed by admiration, fear, or attention. Without reflection from others, the narcissistic self feels hollow. So they curate an image, they exaggerate success, they demand validation, they rewrite history. They are not lying because they enjoy deception. They are lying because reality threatens their self-concept, and anyone who punctures that image becomes dangerous. This is why criticism feels like annihilation to them. Not because they are sensitive, but because their identity has no internal anchor. So they react with rage, dismissal, mockery, or silent punishment, which leads to the second layer, Machiavellianism. Here, people are not experienced as equals. They are resources. Inside this mind, relationships are transactional. Trust is not given, it is exploited. Emotions are not shared, they are studied. The Machiavellian individual learns early that manipulation works. That truth-telling costs power. That vulnerability invites leverage. That sincerity is inefficient. So they become strategic. They mirror personalities to gain rapport. They withhold information to maintain advantage. They create confusion to remain central. They are not impulsive. They are patient, and patience makes them dangerous. They are always thinking 2 steps ahead, not because they are intelligent, but because they are afraid to be seen without armor. This is where empathy disappears, not as cruelty, but as indifference. Other people's feelings are data, not experiences. Then comes psychopathy. This is not always violent. It is emotional flatness, a reduced capacity for remorse, guilt, or fear. Inside the psychopathic mind, consequences are abstract. Pain is conceptual. Responsibility feels optional. They can harm without emotional residue. They don't ruminate. They don't self-reflect. They don't internalize damage. This is why apologies, if they come, feel hollow. They are performative, words without weight. Psychopathy allows them to walk away from destruction with ease, not because they are strong, but because they are disconnected. Disconnected from others, disconnected from conscience, disconnected from depth. And finally, the fourth layer, often misunderstood sadism. Not always physical, often psychological. This is where discomfort becomes pleasurable, where control over another's emotional state creates stimulation. Inside this mind, provoking reactions confirms power, anger, fear, confusion, dependence, all signal dominance. They enjoy destabilizing others because it temporarily relieves their own internal emptiness. This is why they push boundaries after trust is established, why they test reactions, why they escalate subtly. They want to see how much they can take, not because they need it, but because it reassures them that they exist above consequence. Together, these traits form a system. Narcissism creates the fragile self. Machiavellianism creates the strategy. Psychopathy removes inhibition. Sadism adds stimulation. This is not a monster, it is a structure. And structures repeat. Toxic people are not always loud. Some are calm, some are refined, some are admired, but internally, the same pattern holds. They cannot tolerate equality because equality exposes emptiness. They cannot tolerate boundaries because boundaries remove access. They cannot tolerate silence because silence removes control. So they provoke, they triangulate, they gaslight, they destabilize, not to destroy you, to stabilize themselves. This is the most important thing to understand. Toxic behavior is not about you. It is about maintaining internal coherence in someone whose inner world is fragmented. They need to feel powerful, to feel real. And when they don't, they manufacture situations that restore that feeling. This is why reasoning with them fails. They are not seeking understanding. They are seeking position. This is why empathy does not disarm them. Empathy gives them information. This is why confrontation escalates. It threatens hierarchy. The mind of toxic people is not chaotic. It is defensive, and defenses are rigid. They do not evolve through insight. They evolve only when power dynamics change, which is why the most effective response is not engagement. It is withdrawal of access, silence, boundaries, distance, not to punish, but to remove fuel, because without reaction, their structure destabilizes. They grow bored. They seek new targets. They move on. And this is where the script flips, because understanding the dark tetrad is not about diagnosing others. It is about recognizing why certain people felt magnetic, intense, unforgettable. They activated your nervous system. They mimicked depth without offering safety. They confused intensity with intimacy. And once you see the structure, you stop romanticizing the damage. You stop internalizing the harm. You stop asking, what did I do wrong? You start asking, why did I stay? And that question leads somewhere different, because the opposite of toxicity is not kindness. It is integration. And integrated people do not feed these structures. They do not provide reaction. They do not negotiate boundaries. They do not seek closure from those incapable of remorse. They walk quietly, decisively, and the toxic mind cannot follow because it cannot survive without leverage. This is not about labeling. It is about seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, the darkness loses its mystique. It becomes predictable, manageable, avoidable. And from that clarity, power returns not as dominance, but as freedom. Freedom from manipulation, freedom from confusion, freedom from repeating the same psychological wars with different faces. Inside the mind of toxic people is not mystery. It is repetition. And once recognized, repetition ends, not with confrontation, with absence. And absence is the one thing the dark tetrad cannot control. And when absence enters the equation, the entire structure begins to crack. Not dramatically, subtly. Toxic people unravel not when they are exposed, but when they are ignored correctly, because their power never came from strength. It came from attention. Attention is oxygen to the dark tetrad. Reaction is nourishment. Emotional engagement is currency. Remove that, and the machinery stalls. This is why silence terrifies them more than confrontation. Confrontation still places them at the center. Silence removes the stage. Inside the toxic mind, silence is not neutral. It is annihilation. Without reaction, their internal narrative collapses. They can no longer confirm dominance, superiority, relevance. The mirror disappears. And when the mirror disappears, panic follows. This is when escalation often occurs. They provoke harder. They guilt more aggressively. They rewrite narratives more wildly. Not because they want resolution, because they want response. They will oscillate between charm and cruelty, between apology and attack, between vulnerability and contempt. All tactics serve the same function: reassert control. This is where most people get pulled back in. They mistake intensity for sincerity. They confuse collapse with accountability. They assume pain equals insight. It doesn't. The dark tetrad can mimic remorse without experiencing it. They can imitate vulnerability without surrendering power. They can say the right words while changing nothing. Why? Because the internal structure has not shifted, and structures do not dissolve through emotion. They dissolve through loss of leverage. That is why boundaries are existential threats to toxic people. Boundaries say, you no longer have access. Access is everything. Access to your emotions, access to your time, access to your self-doubt. Without access, they cannot regulate themselves. And here is the part most people miss. Toxic people are not confident. They are dependent. Dependent on external regulation. Dependent on reactions to feel real. Dependent on destabilizing others to stabilize themselves. This dependency makes them aggressive when deprived. But aggression is not power. It is desperation. Inside the toxic psyche, there is no true self to return to when others leave. Only emptiness. So they cling. They stalk emotionally. They hover psychologically. They linger through memory and guilt. This is why detachment must be clean. Not emotional detachment alone, but energetic detachment. No explaining. No defending. No narrating your healing. Explanation feeds strategy. Defense feeds hierarchy. Narration feeds fascination. Silence starves all three. The moment you stop participating, the dynamic ends not instantly, but inevitably. And then something shifts inside you. You begin to see how predictable toxicity is. The same script, the same emotional hooks, the same cycles of idealization and devaluation. Once seen, they lose power. Mystique dissolves. And what replaces fear is clarity. You stop asking, why did they do this? You start seeing, this is how the structure operates. And structure can be exited. Not fixed, not healed. Exited, this is crucial. You cannot heal a system that does not experience guilt. You cannot reason with a structure that benefits from confusion. You cannot save someone whose identity depends on domination. Trying to do so is not compassion. It is self-sacrifice disguised as virtue. This is where Jung's shadow comes into play. The dark tetrad thrives where the shadow is denied, where power is disowned, where anger is suppressed, where boundaries are moralized away. Toxic people externalize what others repress. They live out domination because others refuse to own assertiveness. They manipulate because others avoid truth. They take because others overgive. This does not excuse them, but it explains why certain people are drawn into their orbit. Unintegrated kindness is exploitable. Unclaimed authority invites invasion. When you integrate your shadow, your capacity to say no, to leave, to be disliked, you become unreadable to toxic minds. They can't hook you. They can't provoke you. They can't position above you because you no longer need to be seen as good. You need to be whole. Wholeness is the antidote. A whole person does not feed narcissism. They do not play power games. They do not offer emotional leverage. They are calm. And calm is disarming, not soothing. Disarming because calm reflects nothing back. And without reflection, the dark tetrad dissolves. They move on. They must. There is nothing to extract. This is the final liberation. not defeating toxicity, outgrowing it, seeing it clearly, understanding its mechanics, refusing to personalize its behavior, and then walking away, not with anger, not with triumph, but with finality. Because the most devastating thing to a toxic mind is not exposure, it is irrelevance. And irrelevance is achieved the moment you reclaim your inner authority. Inside the mind of toxic people is fear, masquerading as power. Once you see that, you stop fearing them. And when fear ends, their influence ends with it. Quietly, completely, without a word. That is real power, not domination. Discernment. And discernment, once embodied, cannot be manipulated. It only moves forward, leaving the darkness behind, unchased, unengaged, and finally without hold. And when you leave it behind like that, without announcement, without explanation, the most important transformation happens where no one else can see it. Inside you, you begin to recognize how much of your life force was spent responding instead of creating. How much mental space was occupied by decoding behavior that was never meant to make sense. How often you were pulled into emotional weather systems that had nothing to do with you. That energy comes back, not all at once, gradually, quietly, decisively. You start thinking more clearly. Your body relaxes in ways it hasn't for years. Your intuition sharpens because it is no longer drowned out by emotional noise. This is when the real contrast becomes obvious. Healthy people feel different. They don't rush you. They don't test you. They don't destabilize you to feel powerful. They don't need to win every interaction. They don't need to control narratives. They don't need to keep you uncertain to keep you close. And once you've seen the dark tetrad clearly, you can never unsee it. The charm that once hypnotized you now feels rehearsed. The intensity that once felt like depth now feels invasive. The confidence that once impressed you now feels hollow, not because you became cynical, because your perception matured. You no longer confuse force with strength. You no longer confuse attention with connection. You no longer confuse charisma with character. This maturity changes how you move through the world. You become slower to trust, but quicker to leave. You become quieter, but more decisive. You become less available, but more real. And that combination is powerful, not in a dramatic way, in a stabilizing one. Toxic people sense it immediately. They feel it as resistance they cannot penetrate, as neutrality they cannot provoke, as boundaries they cannot negotiate. They test once, maybe twice, and then they disengage. Because the dark tetrad cannot function without leverage. No leverage, no game. This is where many people make a mistake. They think this understanding should make them angry. It doesn't. Anger still binds you to the structure. Understanding releases you from it. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure. You don't need validation. You have clarity. And clarity dissolves obsession. You see now that toxic people are not powerful because they dominate. They dominate because they are fragmented. They need external control because they lack internal coherence. They need hierarchy because equality terrifies them. They need reaction because silence exposes them. This doesn't make them monsters. It makes them predictable. And predictability removes fear. Once fear is gone, you stop orienting your life around avoidance. You start orienting it around alignment. You choose environments that feel calm. You choose relationships that feel mutual. You choose goals that expand you instead of draining you. You don't explain these choices to everyone. You don't need to. Your life becomes the explanation. This is where the final inversion happens. The people who once felt powerful now feel small, not because you diminished them, but because you no longer inflated them with your attention. And you who once felt confused, depleted, destabilized, feel grounded. Not euphoric, grounded, grounded enough to trust yourself again, grounded enough to walk away early. grounded enough to say no without anger. This is the true antidote to toxicity. Not confrontation, not analysis, not endless understanding, self-possession. When you possess yourself, nothing else can possess you. The dark tetrad loses its grip not because it is defeated, but because it is no longer fed. And what grows in its absence is something far more powerful than control. Freedom. The freedom to choose peace without guilt. The freedom to disengage without explanation. The freedom to live without psychological warfare. Once you have that freedom, the darkness has no mystery left. Only distance. And distance, when chosen consciously, is not avoidance. It is wisdom. And wisdom, once embodied, becomes the final boundary no toxic mind can cross. And once that boundary is embodied, not spoken, not negotiated, but lived, you begin to see how deeply the world has been shaped by unexamined darkness. Not evil, unintegrated power. You notice how many systems reward domination over coherence. How many relationships mistake control for leadership. How many cultures confuse confidence with conscience. The dark tetrad does not exist only in individuals. It scales. It thrives anywhere image matters more than integrity. Anywhere fear is mistaken for authority. Anywhere silence is enforced instead of chosen. And here is the uncomfortable truth Jung warned about. What we do not make conscious, we will meet as fate. Toxic people feel inevitable to those who have not yet integrated their own shadow. Because the shadow is not darkness. It is disowned power. The power to say no. The power to withdraw. The power to be disliked. The power to leave without explanation. When these powers are denied internally, they appear externally as domination. The dark tetrad lives where the shadow is projected outward. This is why the same patterns repeat across different faces, different names, different roles, same structure, until awareness interrupts the loop. And awareness is not passive, it is disruptive. Once you see the structure, you can no longer participate unconsciously. You stop giving emotional access where there is no accountability. You stop mistaking charm for safety. You stop believing intensity equals truth. You begin to notice early signals, the subtle contempt behind compliments, the calculated vulnerability that appears only when leverage is needed, the pattern of blame without repair, the absence of remorse followed by demands for understanding. You don't argue with these signals. You don't explain them away. You act quietly, early, decisively. This is the most radical shift of all. You stop waiting for proof of harm. You trust the signal because you now understand something essential. Healthy people do not require confusion to connect. They do not need power to feel secure. They do not test your boundaries to see how much you'll tolerate. Consistency becomes your metric, not words, not promises, not intensity. Consistency over time. And the dark tetrad cannot maintain consistency without control. Eventually, the mask slips. Always, your task is not to expose it. Your task is to be gone when it does. This is where liberation becomes permanent. You are no longer scanning for danger. You are oriented toward alignment. You don't ask, is this person toxic? You ask, do I feel grounded here? That question cuts through everything. Your body answers before your mind can rationalize. And you listen. Listening to the body is how you exit manipulation. The body does not lie to protect illusions. It tightens. It contracts. It signals. When you honor those signals, you stop entering the battlefield altogether. And that is the final evolution. You don't fight darkness. You become unavailable to it. This unavailability is not withdrawal from life. It is engagement with truth. You still love. You still connect. You still risk, but you do so from a place of wholeness. And wholeness cannot be exploited, because exploitation requires a gap, a hunger, a wound, a need to be chosen. When that gap closes, the dark tetrad has nowhere to enter. No hooks, no leverage, no supply, just absence. And absence is devastating to a structure that exists only through reaction. So the story ends not with confrontation, but with clarity. Not with victory, but with exit. You walk away without rage, without explanation, without looking back. And in that walking away, something profound becomes clear. You were never meant to understand darkness to survive it. You were meant to outgrow it. Once outgrown, it cannot follow, because it does not evolve. It repeats, and you no longer do. That is the final power. Not dominance, not control. Discernment embodied, and once embodied, it becomes the quiet force that shapes your entire life, keeping what is real, releasing what is not, and leaving the darkness exactly where it belongs, behind you, and that is where it ends. Not with a confrontation, not with a warning, not with a final lesson delivered to those who harmed you. It ends with clarity. Clarity so complete it no longer needs language. You no longer feel the urge to explain what you see. You no longer feel the need to defend your distance. You no longer wonder whether you were right to leave, because your nervous system tells you the truth your mind once argued against. You are calmer now, not numb, not closed, calm in a way that only comes when danger is no longer nearby. The dark tetrad fades from your life not because it was defeated, but because it was understood. And what is understood loses its grip. You see now that toxic power is loud because it is hollow. That manipulation is elaborate because it is unstable. That domination is necessary only where inner authority is absent. You stop fearing these personalities once you see how dependent they are. Dependent on reaction, dependent on chaos, dependent on others staying confused. You are no longer confused, and that is the end of their reach. You do not become harder, you become clearer. You do not become suspicious of everyone. You become precise about who has access. You do not withdraw from life. You engage it without distortion. This is the final integration Jung pointed toward, but few complete. The moment when the shadow is no longer projected outward because it has been reclaimed inward. You now own your power to leave, your power to say no, your power to be misunderstood and still remain whole. And with that ownership, the mind of toxic people loses relevance, not interest, relevance. They become background noise in a life that has finally found its center. You move forward without obsession, without resentment, without unfinished business. Because the truest closure was never an apology. It was freedom. Freedom to choose peace without guilt. Freedom to trust yourself without hesitation. Freedom to live without psychological warfare. Inside the mind of toxic people is repetition. Inside your life now is movement. And movement does not look back. It simply continues quieter, stronger, unburdened. This is not the end of awareness. It is the end of entanglement. And from here on, your path is no longer shaped by darkness you try to understand, but by clarity you chose to embody. That is the final power. And it lasts.